I'm going to now have the privilege to introduce Todd Godfrey. Todd is an attorney with Hayes, Godfrey, and Bell, who is a legal advisor to the League of Cities and Towns. He updated the Powers and Duties Handbook that you all received today and is one of the foremost authorities on municipal law in the state of Utah. We're proud to have him on our team. And over the next little while here, he's going to tell you everything you need to know or not know about local government. So Todd, take it away.
Thank you. My worst nightmare is holding a microphone. If I break into the Righteous Brothers camp, just nudge me, get me back on track. The worst thing in the world for me is to stand and just talk. And so I really, really like interaction during my discussions with you. I know this is weird when it's remote. Right now I'm seeing Cedar City. Previously I've seen Ephraim, the good folks in Sanpete County. If you have something to say, speak out, and the league staffers will get my attention, or you'll get my attention. But this is intended to be interactive. The worst thing you want to do is sit here for an hour and listen to an attorney talk. Nobody wants that. It's not good for the soul. I understand that. So, speak out. Cam introduced our firm. Just a little bit more about us. Our firm's been representing municipal interests since the late 1960s. I haven't been doing it that long. In the late 1960s, I was in preschool. But we have 5 attorneys in our office. Well, we have 4 attorneys in our office now. There's a 5th attorney who doesn't come to the office anymore. He spends his time in warmer places. But we're all available to talk to you, to answer questions, to discuss with you the issues you face. Every attorney in our office is lead counsel for a city or a town somewhere in this state, and most of us for more than one community. There are issues that come up all the time in our office that we have not seen before, but that's the exception, not the rule. What you face usually we've heard about at some point in time, and we have a little background, and we're happy to help you. I am thrilled with the opportunity to help the good folks from the league. I can't emphasize enough. Rudyard Kipling wrote that great line in the Jungle Book. I think it says, "The strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack." I have seen so many times the league buoyed up by particular cities, and the league will buoy you up. You'll have tough times. You'll have difficult things. I was in Washington last year with my family. We were traveling out on the Olympic Peninsula, and we traveled from the peninsula back into, the Seattle area. And I actually went to law school in Washington and Seattle. I practiced up there for a couple of years. I started my practice doing, I sat in a back room and did research and edited memorandums on a really nationally famous sexually oriented business case. Don't ever let your kids start their careers that way. It's not the thing to do. But I was also prosecuting while I was doing that. And my office was right next to the ferry terminal in a little suburb of Seattle called Edmonds. It's a beautiful town, incredible community. And so I looked out my back windows at the Sound right next to the ferry terminal. And as we were coming across from the peninsula to the Seattle area, we were going into the Edmonds ferry terminal. And I thought, this is so cool. My kids are going to get to see the office I worked in. And as we got closer into Edmonds, I could see on both sides of the ferry terminal, and it didn't look like what it looked like in 1992 at all. And I realized that the office I worked in was gone. And this, sort of dated office complex that I was on the second floor of with these big glass windows had been replaced by 4-story condos. And so at some point, some of you are going to be responsible for crushing somebody's dream with redevelopment. It's just part of what happens in cities, right? I'm not cynical or bitter about it. It doesn't really matter. But you make decisions that are significant. Now, as we got off the ferry terminal and we got into Edmonds, Edmonds was bustling. And the old shops that were kind of dilapidated when I were there were renewed and beautiful. And there were great restaurants. And they had these cool parking terraces that were fantastic with businesses above them and residents above those. And the redevelopment was just remarkable. And you have a hand in some of those things. You really do. And for those of you who work in rural communities, if you think I'll never see anything like that, you may not. but you'll see something where you make a significant difference in people's lives. You know, we think a lot about what we do as government and what our roles are. And there really, in my mind, are kind of three purposes for local government. And the first one is that local government is a service provider, the basic municipal services that people receive. So streets to drive on, water that works when you turn the tap. We carry the dirty water away. When it rains, we make the water go where it's supposed to go. We provide public safety services. That's the real core purpose of local government. And a ton of our communities in this state and all over the country were actually incorporated, organized for that purpose. A ton of our cities were created on the basis of how are we going to provide this particular municipal service that really is important and necessary. The second thing that I think government does is it kind of puts the home in hometown. Your placemakers, right? Some of you, I'm sure, ran for office with that as your purpose and what you intend to do. That's right up there on the list. I think that's critical and vitally important. That's why we have festivals and parades, and we do all those things. We create communities and places. I grew up in Logan. I have lived in Salt Lake longer than I lived in Logan. Logan is still my hometown. Everybody has a hometown, right? Logan's still mine. Cam, when he talks about communities in the state, he goes from end to end, right? He said Clarkston. My dad grew up in Clarkston. It is a tiny place in the very northern part of this state, but it's a hometown for people, and it has its own sense of community. That's important. That's kind of the second thing that I think we do as cities. The third is we govern and we regulate. We pass laws about barking dogs and, you know, those kind of things. We zone, right? We do land use. This may be a revelation to some of you. I think that's the least important of the three functions of cities. I really do. I think service provision is the most important. And there are issues that come up from time to time in every community. Right now, statewide, we're facing huge growth issues. Those issues bubble up in their own ways. But over the course of time, I think you'll find that providing municipal services is the most important function. Creating place is really important. Governing, regulating conduct is probably the least of those purposes. It will occupy a ton of your time, and it will certainly get your attention. But I think it's probably the least important of those three sort of core powers and duties that we engage in. If I'm not careful, I'm going to start looking at Cam's notes instead of mine. So as cities and towns across the state, we're really different, right? I mean, Cottonwood Heights is very different from Clarkston. Trust me. We're really different, but we're organized in sort of a common template. So every city and town in this state is a creature of the legislature. There's times when, you know, my interactions with the legislature, that makes me bristle, but it's a fact. It's the way it is. We're creatures of state law. So the Utah Constitution provides that the legislature is obligated to create a template for the organization of cities and towns. They've done that in the state municipal code. Title 10 of the state code is what we refer to as the state municipal code. And that's the background template that is drawn on to create each city and town in this state. That template makes you all similar in a lot of ways, but it also creates some pretty stark differences. So there are basically 4 different forms of government that a city can be organized under now. There's exceptions, there's variations, but broadly there's 4 kinds, right? You can be what we call a council mayor form of government. So Logan, I think Ogden, Salt Lake, South Salt Lake, Orem, right? Provo, Taylorsville, and Murray. These four, Marriott, Slaterville, I always forget that one. These cities are organized under the council mayor form. That form mimics what you see at the state level or at the federal level. It is a separation of powers government. It has a mayor who is not a member of the council and doesn't act as a member of the council. Mayor generally attends council meetings, but doesn't chair the council meetings. Mayor doesn't vote on anything, but has a veto. And the functions in that form of government are very, very separated. The council is a legislative body only. It's really all they do. And the mayor handles executive and administrative roles traditionally. That's one form of government. There is something that we now call in this state the 6-member council form of government. And people who are as old as and gray as I am still call that the traditional city form. The 6-member council form of government is composed generally of a mayor and 5 council members. Mayor is not a voting member of the council, and he is a part of what we call the governing body. Mayor generally chairs the meetings of the council, but only votes in really limited circumstances. You know, the appointment of a city manager, the dismissal of a city manager, a tie vote. He can break a tie. She can break a tie. That's the way that function generally looks on our books, right? And that is, I would say, the most common form for our cities in this state. There's a 5-member council form of government. We old guys like me refer to that as the traditional town form, but it is used in a number of cities also. That is a mayor and 4 council members, excuse me, so a 5-member governing body. The mayor votes in that form of government. And that's a really common form also. It started out as being what we call the town form. That's the way most of our towns in this state were and are organized. And those towns grew and became cities. Some of them changed their forms of government to 6-member forms or others. Some just stayed in that same form. And so that's what that looks like. Then there is one last form of government that is still out there. We used to call it the council manager form. There are very few communities that have that. Cottonwood Heights does. Holiday kind of does in its own way. But it is a form where there's a council with a mayor. They all vote. Mayor is what we used to refer to as ceremonial. I don't like that term. I've never met a mayor in this state who truly was only ceremonial. I don't believe that. So, but they all vote, and that then the administrative and a lot of the executive function is handled by a professional city manager. Now, those are kind of templates. All of you fit kind of into one of those forms, but it looks different for all of you in some ways. And that's because when the state legislature organized those forms, they didn't dictate every single little jot and tittle of the law. They've allowed councils that came before you to write on that template in different ways to create the structure that works in the communities that you're now going to serve in. So the mayor in one town with a 6-member council form may act very differently than the mayor in another city with a 6-member council form. The city managers in different cities of the same form may act and perform their duties in very different ways, may be given very different sets of duties. All of that is good and fine and legal under the state code. It's very rare that we see something where we find a city stepped outside the boundaries of their particular form of government. It happens, but it's the exception. So what does that mean for you in your particular city? Well, we have the state code that writes the general template, and then each city has a code of ordinances. And in that code of ordinances, there will be some sort of an administrative code that details what the mayor's duties are, what the council's duties are. If you have a city manager, what the city manager does. In some of our towns, they may have 2 part-time employees. They may have no part-time employees. In many of our towns, it may be that the mayor and the elected council of the town perform all the administrative functions of the town. I was doing some litigation work for a small town in this state several years ago, and we had an issue with the sewer system. And I was asking questions about the sewer system, and they said, well, you know, that was John Kaiser used to handle that. And well, John Kaiser was a council member, but he was the guy who ran the sewer for the town. And when John Kaiser wasn't on the council anymore, somebody else was on the council and they ran the sewer system for the town. That's common. That's normal. And the code allows for that. The code also allows a city or a town to create an organization with departments and department heads if you choose to organize that way. And they provide those functions. So there's a broad template. Your cities will write on that template the way they have. And none of you, well, that's not true. IRTA, is anybody from IRTA in any of these meetings? I wonder. I'm guessing somebody is. IRTA is writing on a blank slate. They are a brand new city in this state. And so they're writing on a blank slate. The rest of you, I think that's the only one we have that's new, isn't it, Cam? The rest of you aren't. Something's already been written for you, and you're walking into a circumstance now where there's already a set of laws and ordinances that govern what you're going to do.
Organization of laws set up already for city council and commissioners, planning commissioners as well?
Yeah, it generally is. The question is that organization of law set up already for city councils and planning commissioners? And the answer in any established community generally is yes. And you'll find really big differences about that. So planning commissions are a good topic to sort of spend just a little bit of time about. I don't want to dive into land use too heavily, but the law provides that every city or town is to have a planning commission. And there's not a whole lot more direction than that in the law. It tells you what the planning commission does. It handles recommendations on legislative land use issues, and it can be given the authority to make decisions on administrative land use issues. But you have to have a planning commission to sort of assist the city in land use matters. The intent is that you would hire, appoint people to your planning commission who are experienced and knowledgeable in those things and could give good recommendations and good advice to the city council or make good decisions on those issues. It doesn't say that the planning commission has to be 7. It doesn't say that the planning commission has to be 5. Was it Mark Twain that said committees should always be odd numbers and 3 is too many? I believe that. And it would be great if some city had the courage to appoint a planning commission of 1. They would make really good decisions. They would be very efficient. Things would work great. That's not the way we work. And I've never seen that. And I don't think I ever will. It'd be great if it happened. But yeah, those structures for the council, the planning commission, other city boards and commissions are generally already set in ordinance. Now, sometimes they're established in practice. They're not written down. And the law really doesn't require that all those things be written down. I will tell you, you should have ordinances about your planning commission. Your tree committee, is it helpful? Yeah. Is it a good idea? Yes. Is the world going to fall in if you don't? No. Right. And so we sort of orient ourselves and we adjust the way we do business to the community we live in and what we do. A lot of you were elected and you have ideas about how you want to do things, how you want to change things, how you think things should run. All of that's appropriate. Every bit of it is. And many of you will be successful in seeing those things happen. And some of you will find, I guess I would call it organizational barriers. And you'll find that your inertia isn't quite getting you over the finish line on those things. There are people who are elected all the time because there's one issue that drives them nuts. That's not wrong. But what you're taking on in this obligation as city council members or mayors is a pretty broad service gig. So plant your feet and get ready. It's going to come at you, and there's going to be a ton to do. And I think at the end of your time, you're going to find it's a great, great opportunity, and you can make a huge difference. What really affects people's lives directly, you generally have some control over, right? The policy issues that get decided at the state level are significant and important, and they matter at a really high level. But the timing of the snow plow in front of somebody's house, the response time for a fire engine or a police car, the continued, consistent, flawless functioning of a sewer system, those things are candidly bigger day-to-day impacts in people's lives, and that's what you do. So that idea of local control is really significant, and it really matters. The transition into doing the business the way you're going to have to do it now as council members is something we have to understand. This state and almost every other state have adopted what I think came to be called in the late 60s or early 70s as what they called sunshine laws. In this state, it's called the Open and Public Meetings Act. It's a legislative decision by the state that controls the way you handle the business of the city. And what it says is that the business of cities is intended to be conducted in the open with transparency. And that is the policy of the state that you're obligated to observe. Dave Church, who was formerly in my position in the league, used to always say, in this state, we have traded efficiency for transparency. And that's dead right. I recall hearing Dave give a presentation one time where he said, we could do this job a lot better if we could do it in secret. We could make decisions quicker, we could make them more efficiently, and they might even be sometimes better decisions if we could do it in a back room with the door closed. Because some of the decisions we have to make are really hard. And people are angry about them. And we get influenced sometimes by their anger and their emotion. And it would be lots easier if we could do it in a back room. Doesn't matter. We have traded that potential efficiency for transparency in this state. Everything you do has to be done out in the open. So the Open and Public Meetings Act has kind of two critical definitions and then lots of little ones that flow down from it. But first, and I say this a little bit cynically, but the Open and Public Meetings Act affects you far differently than it affects the state legislature. So when you watch the state legislature do what they do not get the idea that you can do that. They have decided that the rules that apply to you don't have to apply to them. So just can't fight it. Nothing we can do about it. It just is what it is. It's already been decided. It's what we live with. So the Open and Public Meetings Act defines a public body as two or more people who are created by ordinance or resolution or policy or some other law that is charged with dealing with the public's business in some way, supported by public funds, and either recommends or makes decisions regarding those matters they're charged with. So councils, you're a public body. The Open and Public Meetings Act applies to you by intent, by purpose, and we don't work to get around it. The next thing it defines is a meeting, and it defines a meeting as a convening of a public body. And convening means a call for a meeting by somebody who has authority to make the call. And then it accepts from the definition of meetings only two things. One, a chance social gathering. So if three of you run into each other at Lowe's or Home Depot, that's not a meeting. Or two, a social gathering, a wedding reception, something like that. That's not necessarily a meeting. Every other time you're in a meeting. So if three of you in a 6-member council forum, and the three of you happen to be council members, want to get together to talk about an issue, you are having a meeting within the definition of the Open and Public Meetings Act. And that means you have to do everything that the act requires. It has to be noticed on an agenda at least 24 hours in advance. It has to be open to the public. You have to keep minutes and record the meeting. All of that's official. In a 6-member council form, 2 members of the council and the mayor can meet and not have a meeting. In a 5-member council form, 2 members of the council can meet, whatever that looks like. If you get to 2 council members and or 3 council members in the 6-member form, you're having a meeting. If you get to 3 members in the 5 council member form, you're having a meeting. So you have to observe all the niceties of public meetings under the Open to Public Meetings Act to do that. There will be times when you'll have questions over the next year or 2 years or something about, can we create a committee to look at a particular issue and study it? Yes. The composition of that committee may make them a public body, and they would have to require with the provisions of the Open and Public Meetings Act. It is a crime to try and avoid the provisions of the Open and Public Meetings Act. So don't do that. Prior to your election, there were a handful of felonies that were totally off the table for you. They weren't part of your life. Now they are. So let's not try and bring those into play, right? We avoid those things. Every meeting is a meeting. So you'll find that some cities talk about work sessions. They talk about study sessions. You'll from time to time wonder, can we convene in a work session without having the public sitting in the room with us and listening to everything we say? The answer is no, you can't. Every meeting of a public body by its terms has to be open to the public. That's just the law. So when you want to have a work meeting or a study session and you want to talk about an issue, it's open to the public. Now, do you have to allow the public to participate in that meeting other than just to be there and listen? No, you don't. There are only certain times that the law requires that you allow the public to participate. So you can have those meetings where they can be there, they can be in the back of the room, they can hear everything, but you don't have to allow them to comment. You can keep them from commenting if you choose to for the good order of the meeting. That's fine, but it's an open meeting for the public. The only times you can close a meeting to the public are when you want to talk about pending or reasonably imminent litigation and strategy for your city or town in dealing with that. So pending means it's going on now, right? Reasonably imminent, in my opinion, does not mean we think maybe somebody might be mad enough to at some point sue us over this. That's not it. I think you have to have had a reasonable threat of imminent litigation to close a meeting for that reason. So that's one exception. 2, you can close a meeting to discuss the character or competence or physical or mental health of an individual. So if you need to talk about someone in particular and their ability to perform in a particular function or role, their character, their competence, their physical or their mental health, you can close a meeting for that purpose. Could you close a meeting to talk generally about personnel of the city? No. It has to be the character or professional competence or the physical or mental health of an individual. That's it. You can close a meeting to talk about the acquisition or disposition of real property, the strategy concerning that, if it is necessary to close the meeting to protect sort of the price on which the city will acquire or sell the property. So that's a critical part of the whole analysis. It has to be for the purpose of protecting the city's financial interest in the acquisition or disposition of real property, right? And then you can close a meeting to talk about the deployment of security devices. So if you need to give everybody the password for something, you can close a meeting and do it. If you need to talk about where it's wise to deploy security cameras on a public building or in a public park. You can close the meeting for that. Just makes sense, right? Yeah, the question is logistically, when we close a meeting, can we do that right in the middle of a meeting? So something comes up that would be an appropriate purpose for a closed session. We're in the middle of discussion. Can we close the meeting right there, kick everybody out and do it? Yes, you can. You'll find that a number of cities will, when they create their agendas for their city council meetings, their town council meetings, will sometimes have an actual agenda item for a closed session. Perfectly appropriate. I like that. I think it's the correct and courteous thing to do as it relates to your dealings with the public. I think that's great. You'll see some cities or towns that have at the end of every single council agenda a potential closed session, and they'll list all the purposes that are available under the law. I don't mind that. I don't think that's inappropriate. I don't think it adds anything, but I think it's fine. It is also my opinion that whether that closed session appears on your agenda or not, if in the course of the council's business and discussion, it becomes apparent that it would be legally appropriate to close the meeting and the council wants to do so, you can do that, whether it's listed on your agenda or not. There are contrary opinions to that out in the public. I will tell you, there are some people that think differently than me on that. My opinion is you can do it, and you will see nothing written in the law that excludes it. And I've had my clients do it more than a dozen times, and I think it's the right thing to do when the discussion is appropriate for that, right? So to close a meeting, you have to have 2/3 of the voting members of the council approve the closed meeting. So in a 6-member council, if all 6 members, or a 6-member forum, excuse me, if all 6 members are there and only 3 think it's appropriate to close the meeting, you're not there. Right? Closure, just remember in your mind that closing a meeting requires that little teeny bit of a supermajority. So that's
Todd,
something, yes.
We got a couple questions here in Orem if you want to take them.
I would love to take them.
Let's go. You want to go first? Here and then here?
Sure. If a council wants to talk about qualifications of a member of the community that they're considering to appoint to a board like a planning commission, can they go into a closed session at that time?
So the answer is a qualified yes, but let me tell you what the qualification is. You are specifically prohibited in the state law from using a closed session to discuss the character or competence or traits of an individual who is applying to fill what would otherwise be an elected office. So if you have a council vacancy or a mayoral vacancy, you are prohibited in the law from using a closed session to discuss that person. So for those of you who will be filling council vacancies starting the first of the year, and that happens frequently, a mayor from the council will run and be elected mayor. They have an unexpired term. You have to appoint somebody to fill that. You are not permitted to go into closed session to discuss those folks. You have to do the interviews and the discussion all in an open meeting. For a planning commissioner, for an appointed office of the city, for an employee of the city, yes, you can close the meeting to do that. And I think it's appropriate.
All right, then we have one more question here in Orem.
So my question is, if you have a closed meeting to review the acquisition or bidding on a property and you don't obtain that property, is that information then available through GRAMA, or do you need to make that public?
Information that comes up in a closed session is designated under GRAMA as protected, in some cases private. It would actually be an offense to disclose that information. So no, it's not subject to the provisions of GRAMA. Now, there's a point in time where appraisals the city acquires on certain properties may become public, but it's my opinion that if an acquisition does not ever occur, that remains a protected record.
What they bid for something.
Yeah.
Potentially underbid, wouldn't you want to know that?
Well, when you say you, who are you speaking of?
It was a they at the time, but now it's me, but you know, if the council, the public wanted them to obtain this property and they said, okay, we're gonna put in a bid, but then how do you know if their intent was actually to obtain the property or they just put in a lowball bid that there was no chance they'd ever get it?
Yeah, so you're talking about a question that has some niceties to it that are a little bit difficult to answer in this format. I will tell you generally that remains a protected record. There are circumstances and there would be a point after time where I think that classification could change and it could become public. But let me give you a general caution that I think comes up from these subjects all the time. Discussions that occur in closed sessions are confidential discussions. And they have, even though those discussions don't necessarily always create a record, if you're talking about personnel, we don't always record those. We just sign an affidavit at the end of the meeting. But even though they don't necessarily create a written hard record, they're confidential. And the disclosure of that kind of information actually carries criminal penalties under the state law. There will be times when, as a council member, you may feel like your fellow council members aren't acting appropriately. You may feel like things aren't happening that you think are correct or right, and you want to tell the world. Don't. That's my counsel. Don't. That's protected information. So now, are there qualifications to that? Yeah, sure. You know, there are qualifications if the conduct is actually illegal. You know, we can talk about a lot of things, but the general rule is don't. Now, when a specific question comes up about that and you wonder what to do, please talk to your city attorney. So I am not your city attorney. I am the attorney for the league. If your city or town doesn't have an attorney, call me. I'll be happy to discuss it with you. If you do have an attorney and you still choose to call me and you've talked to your attorney and you don't tell me you've talked to your attorney, that's the one way you can get on my bad side. There aren't a lot of ways, but that's one of the ways. There's attorneys get shopped. We understand. We know you opinion shop from time to time. We get it, but don't do it to me without telling me. Just call and say, I've talked to my attorney. This is his opinion. What's yours? Totally fine. And then if my opinion conflicts with your attorney's probably smarter than me. Trust him. So are there other questions out there? We will get there. The question was, do we want to talk about conflicts of interest? And we're going to get there. We're going to talk about it. So Cam is telling me to go 10 minutes over. If you're all quiet, you're not going to like me going 10 minutes over. I can do it, but you're not going to like it. I really do hope if you have questions, you'll ask them. It helps. And by the way, if you have a question, my guess is somebody else in another room somewhere across the state has the same question. So
Todd,
you know,
this is Susan in Cedar City. Mine is just a request. When you have someone in your room that has a question to ask, please ask them to turn on their mic. Just press the button or whatever device you have there so that we can hear them at the other locations. Thank you.
We'll try and do that, Susan. If I'm not repeating the question, remind me too. Like wave your arms or something, because you're on my screen right now. So let's make sure we get that done.
Do we just talk?
Just
hold
this button down.
Okay. Who do we talk to if we feel like our city attorney is violating his or her ethics or?
Well, okay, tough question, and I'm going to take, tough question. I'm going to take it on. The question was, who do we talk to if we feel like our city attorney is violating ethics provisions, not performing their duties, not doing what they're supposed to do? And so I'm going to give you the answer that I would want my clients to utilize. First of all, I hope you talk to them and you're direct with them and you explain why. And then when you don't have a resolution to the issue and you still feel like there's an issue, feel free to call me and I'll I'm going to be straight with you right now. When you call me and ask about a land use matter, I'm going to give you an answer. When you call and ask about sort of a general governance question, I'm going to give you an answer. When you call and say, my city attorney's not performing his duty and he's falling short, and this is why, I'm going to listen to you. And chances are I may not weigh in on that call with you. I'm more likely than to call your city attorney and have a conversation with them. And at that point, then there is a high likelihood that I will call you back, tell you what's gone on, tell you about the discussion I had. And then if we think there's something further that needs to happen, we'll counsel about it. But one of the things the league does not want me to do is to get in the middle of that kind of a relationship. So when you think your city attorney, if you think your mayor, if you think another member of the council is not performing in a way that's ethical, appropriate, right, good, have the conversation with them first. We're not really mediators or referees. That's not the role. But if you have concerns at a level and you don't have anywhere else you can turn, I'm happy to have you call me. We'll counsel together and we'll help you get to a place where you feel like, A, I've been heard, or B, even better, there's a resolution. Other questions?
How does the Open and Public Meetings Act apply to committees that have been appointed by the council or mayor?
If they are more than two, if they have been vested with the authority or task to either make decisions or recommendations on matters of the public interest, if they are supported by public funds, and that's really broad, if they're meeting in City Hall, if they are in any way using city staff for support, they're a public body and they have to comply with the Open and Public Meetings Act also, which means their meetings have to be agended, they have to be recorded, minutes have to be taken, all those things happen. So a tree committee, a historical commission, a Parks and Recreation committee, a trails committee, generally, we're going to find that those are public bodies and they have to comply with the Open and Public Meetings Act. No other questions. We're going to start talking now about the last topic, which is great. Logan, you're on.
Perfect. So question would be on these closed meetings discussing litigation. Is there a conflict of interest if the litigation involves a member of the city council?
Yep.
What
There is.
Okay, where can we find the rules and regulations on that?
I'll talk to you about that in just a second. That's the next topic we're going to get to. But while we're there, there's a point of governance there that I think is really important. And it's a difficult one, and we don't have a great resolution for it in the law right now. There will be times where in those closed sessions, you feel like the interest of a council member or a mayor may go beyond the traditional interest of every other citizen in the community, right? So their interest may be more particularized than the general public interest, and you feel like that presents a conflict. So I was involved in a situation a little while ago where a council closed a meeting to talk about the acquisition of property. One member of the council he didn't have a direct ownership interest. He didn't live proximate to the property, but he'd had some dealings with some folks where they were involved with the property in some way. And he felt like his interest was so remote that it wasn't a conflict. He didn't need to be excused from the discussion. The rest of the council felt differently. There is not a mechanism as a city council for you to force a member to leave one of those closed sessions in that kind of a circumstance. There's just not. So the choice then for the council is, do we go ahead and have this meeting with this person here and, understand all the risks and the issues with that? Or do we wait and handle this a different way, which would be council members having one-on-one discussions about the subject matter and working through it that way without the benefit, candidly, of what I think is the group dynamic. That's a real benefit. So that's just an issue to put on the table. If the discussion relating to property is something in which the council member has a direct interest, yes, that's a conflict and they should not participate. So we'll jump right into that. Our state ethics act for municipal officers and employees is found in Title 10, Chapter 13. It's the Utah Municipal Officers and Ethics Act. Utah generally has a set of laws that require disclosure of every potential or actual conflict of interest. So when you take office, at some point in time, your city or town should give you a form that is a disclosure form where you disclose any business you may operate that is regulated by the city, any business that directly does business with the city of which you're a part or have ownership, or other sort of interest that may create an actual or potential conflict of interest. It will require you to disclose when you're assisting someone who's doing business with the city. So as an attorney, if I were on a council somewhere and I had a client who was trying to develop some property in the city, I would have to disclose that on a disclosure form. And then when that matter comes up before the council, I have to make that disclosure public in the meeting. And I have to make sure the mayor is aware of that. All the specifics of this are in the act, and I don't want to get too down deep in the woods. But what I want to make sure you understand is this state in its ethics act requires disclosure of every conflict of interest. Our state ethics act doesn't say anything about recusing yourself from participation when you have a conflict of interest. Please recuse yourself when you have a direct conflict of interest. Even though the state act only requires disclosure, if it's your piece of property that the council's talking about and you're the mayor on the council, in the open meeting, say, the next item on the agenda concerns my piece of property. I'm not participating. Stand up, walk away from the dais, take your seat, let the meeting have its course, and then you can take your seat again when that meeting's conducted. I'll tell you a few horror stories. I was in a high growth community a few years ago, had a council member who I was so unbelievably proud of, stood up when the item was called and said, my property, a piece of property I own, is included in this development application. I shouldn't be participating. Stood up, walked down, sat in the audience, right? And then as the item was being discussed, he stood back up and walked up to the dais where the public goes to talk and started talking to the council about why their discussions were off base and wrong and they were missing the point. And don't do that. When you're recused, go. You know, if the temptation is too much for you, leave the building for a while and have somebody on staff call you when you can come back. But it's kind of I think our ethics act is relatively common sense. I don't think it's really complicated. You cannot line your own pockets based on your office. The law doesn't allow it. You cannot gain for someone else some special benefit or privilege that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get because of your office. Can't do that. So I think at the end of the day, our Ethics Act is fairly common sense. The disclosure standard in the Utah Act is the minimum standard. Please act a little more appropriately than what our act even would require. There are cases where disclosure won't be enough. And some people need to step away when that comes up.
Todd,
Yes.
question here in Orem.
Orem, go.
Muted. Oh, go ahead. Now you're good.
Okay.
Go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Question. So if you were a city council member and you have an employment position that would be directly impacted with something possibly from a project, if you're an engineer or if you are someone who's an attorney, like you said, and something like that, and you are another city council member and you realize that this person, and they are not recusing themselves, is there anything that, do you just go to them directly and say, I think you should recuse yourself? Or is that something where you just stay silent and let the chips fall where they may?
So I've seen that handled really, really appropriately in some cases, and I've seen it handled in other ways that I thought were kind of rough. And the way that I thought was perfectly appropriate was I had a council member ask to be recognized by the chair of the meeting. And the council member asked for an immediate recess, and it was odd and it was out of order and it wasn't at a time you normally would. And I could tell the mayor thought the request was odd. And the council member just said, this is really a significant request and it's important. And I only need 5 minutes, but I think it's critical for the city that we take a 5-minute recess. They just expressed enough urgency that the mayor said, okay. They voted, they had a recess. Council member approached the other council member, was very direct about, this is an issue. I think this is a problem. I don't think you should be participating. I think that's appropriate. I think it's right. The one that I thought was not as appropriate and was more difficult was a council member calling out another council member in a public meeting in front of the public in a way that was really nasty and accusatory. And that sowed seeds of discord that take years to heal, if they ever do. That's tough. And I've seen that happen more than once. And I've seen it happen when the council member who called out the other was technically correct. I've also seen it happen when the council member who called out the other council member was not technically correct and in fact was wholly wrong. And in the one case where they asked for a recess, the council member discussed with the other council member, the discussion proved enlightening and illuminating for both parties. The one who thought the council member had a conflict learned more information that made that far more remote. The other, who, seeing the remoteness of the potential conflict, thought it wasn't an issue, realized somebody could maybe think this was an issue. And when the meeting opened back up, they recused themselves. So there are different ways to handle it. I know those kind of personal conflicts can be difficult, and some of us are attuned to those and some of us aren't. So this is my advice, and I always give this to my own cities where I represent them. Councils work the very best when they govern themselves. You will find your governing body works the very best when you govern yourselves. If you're asking the outside people from your city or town, and that includes your city attorney, to sort of govern you, I think you need to look harder at the way you're doing things. So that's a general rule. That being the rule, I think when you think somebody else is acting in a way that isn't at a standard that you think is appropriate, I have no problem with people calling other people out on those things. I think it's discourteous. I think it presents a bad public image that's damaging to your city or town. And I think it's probably not even just the smartest way to do business to call people out in public meetings. I understand that sometimes we feel compelled. I know that happens. I would avoid that with all of my strength if it were me. Little editorial there, but that's what I think. John.
Thinks the public might perceive that they have a conflict of interest, but they don't believe they don't. Would it be also a good idea in a council meeting to say, some of you might think I have a conflict of interest here, but let me explain to you why I don't, so I'm going to continue on this matter?
Yeah, the question here in Salt Lake is, if a council member doesn't feel they have a conflict, but they understand that there may be a perception in the public that they do, is it appropriate for the council member to give an explanation of their position? The answer in my mind is yes. Now, what you will find in your service on councils is that the very best explanation you can give sometimes will not be enough for the public. That's just the way it goes, right? So you have to weigh those things. But yeah, I absolutely think if you think there's a perception of a conflict of interest, that you believe is not accurate and you don't believe a conflict exists, you know, there's two courses. One, you can go your way and, you know, explain yourself outside of the public meeting, or two, you can make your explanation in the public meeting. You know, I guess I don't have strong feelings about it other than I think it's better to make your record. So it sounded like there was a question somewhere else before we have a question here.
Hey, Todd, can you
Yes.
address? Okay. We had a question about group emails and group texts of elected officials.
Yes, my favorite, most unfavorite topic. Does that come up in San Pete County? I love it if it came up in Ephraim. That's great. So
yes, Ephraim.
So the thing that I always counsel with my clients about is that sort of rolling group text on city business items. So it's a text message that includes all the council members, or an email chain that includes all the council members or all the planning commissioners, you know, whatever that is. In my opinion, you're circumventing the intent of the Open and Public Meetings Act when you do that. Now, the law excludes electronic communications from some of the provisions of the Open and Public Meetings Act. Okay, so technically it's not a crime for you to be communicating that way over text or email. Is it a rolling meeting when you're talking about public business? You bet it is. Absolutely it is. And is it subverting the actual and clearly expressed intent of the Open and Public Meetings Act? Yes, it is. So maybe they couldn't actually prosecute you for a crime, but I still think it's wrong. And I absolutely think it should be avoided. So once in a while, I'll see a buildup where there's a text between two council members, which is appropriate, which is legal, which I don't think subverts the act, and I actually think is important for your duties at times, right? We build consensus in our councils in different ways, and those discussions usually, frequently, often start one-on-one, right? So a discussion between two council members will work up where somebody gets added, and then somebody else may add somebody. All of a sudden, instead of two, we're at four. Now we're a quorum, right? And I watched that happen about 9 months ago on a real critical issue in one of my communities. And a council member called me, sent me all the text messages, said, this is what's happened. And at the next meeting of that body, they made an open and public, they actually put an agenda item on. They made an open disclosure about the text message and the way it built up and what happened. And they put in the record all of their texts. So, you know, is that better than having not disclosed it? Yes, it is. Would it have been better if they hadn't gotten there? Yes, it would have been better. If you're doing something in an attempt to avoid the act, you're violating the act, right? We know that. We understand it. So, you know, could you be prosecuted for a crime for the text messages? Probably not now. Is it wrong? Yeah, I think it's wrong. And my advice would be don't do it.
How about communications from staff to city council or the planning commission, just apprising them of situational awareness?
Those things are important, and I don't know how you would function without them, and I don't have a problem with them. As soon as the council starts weighing in on those emails, though, somebody needs to shut it off, right? And that's common. So you'll get staff that'll send out an email about information between the date your council packet goes out and the date of the meeting. Some additional information might come in, right? Staff will send that information out and they'll give a little explanation. Please don't jump in as council and start talking to all the rest of the council members about the way you interpret, perceive, understand the information. That's for an open meeting, right? Please don't weigh in and say this application is dead in the water and has been since go. It's got no shot. You should have tied a rock to it and dropped it in the ocean. Don't do that in the email chain or the text chain. Wait for the meeting.
We have a question in St. George.
Hang on, St. George. We've got one in Salt Lake and then I'll get to you.
The question is about note taking and then future litigation versus your cell phone versus your computer.
So the question is about note taking and the availability of your notes, your cell phones, your computers in future litigation. So let me just give you this is something you should talk to your individual city attorneys about, because you may have policies that they want to put in place in the way they want to do things. City issued devices are public, period. So if your city is providing for the council an iPad, a Surface, something for your council meetings, those, and the city's paying for it, everything in that is public. And not only is it subject to review and disclosure in litigation, it's actually probably subject to grandma. So, and that's all somebody has to do is fill out a form and hand it to the city recorder to get at that. Your private devices, I will fight tooth and nail to protect every ounce of your private information on your private devices. So your text messages on your phone to your spouse, your kids, all of that, your neighbors, I'll fight tooth and nail to protect it. But your text messages on your private phone to other council members, to city staff, to members, residents of your city about city business, I can fight, but I'm not going to win. So just, be aware of that, right? You're creating public records. So cell phones are so freaking cool. They do so much unbelievable stuff. They are absolutely amazing. The technology is incredible. And a text, if you think it's gone, it's never gone. An email lasts forever. Talk to somebody. Call them on the phone. Actually talk. That doesn't last forever. Your phone will show you made a call. That's all it is. You made the call. So those are all things that I do think you have to think about. Your personal notes are generally not subject to grandma. Your personal notes are very infrequently something we have to turn over in litigation. Electronic communications are. The law, by the way, the law prohibits council members from using electronic communication during a meeting, right? So back in the day, I used to sit next to council members sometimes on a dais who would text each other during a meeting. You cannot legally do that anymore. That's a violation of the Open and Public Meetings Act. Outside the meeting, it doesn't govern that. But during the meeting, you cannot do that anymore. So if any of your cities have open message platforms that are open during a meeting, ask them to close them. Don't have those open. Okay, St. George had a question, right?
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so 2 questions, one quick, maybe one not as quick. As far as text message and email, for example, if the mayor wants to just inform the council of what, when, and where of events, is that appropriate, or does that violate the Open and Public Meeting Act?
Wholly appropriate, not a discussion of substance, not debate, not deliberation. We're meeting here for the ribbon cutting, wholly appropriate. Use it, it's convenient, it's great. And if somebody wants to get it, I'll be happy to turn over your texts between all the council members where the mayor says the ribbon cutting is at 9 o'clock at the corner of Bluff and the Boulevard, right? Fine, you can have that if you want it. So. Okay, second question. Let's say you have a professional of some sort of on the council, and it's either their business or they're employed by a business, say an engineering firm, whatever, land surveyor, whatever it may be. And city staff is contracting with them to do work. And that seems to be going on a consistent, ongoing basis. I recognize that's not legal, but it's not illegal, but is there a best practice in helping staff and council, keep an open playing field for the services that staff contracts for work? Yeah, first of all, the disclosure of that has to be made. It has to be available for the public to see. If there's any kind of an application that occurs at a public meeting, that disclosure should be noted in the open meeting verbally. Say it. put it on the record, make it clear. From the standpoint of the procurement part of that, you're going to want to consult the procurement code of the city, but generally, the city cannot give favoritism to a particular business because it may be run, operated, or a council member may work for that business. That just doesn't work, right? Competitively, the city has an obligation to legally to get the best price for the service. So, those are two sort of different levels. But if a member of the council is, got a business that's contracted with the city on a regular basis, engaged with the city on a regular basis, that is a concern area. It's something that ought to be highlighted, and disclosure of that ought to be frequent and clear. Anything else?
I have a question for you.
Great.
Okay. You mentioned on electronic device use during meetings. Does that include like email? So, or on like a laptop, because we use laptops during our meetings and have our email up. Would that be?
Email between council members is not permitted. That is prohibited by the law. Text, email between council members. If your kids are emailing you during the meeting, that's not a violation of the law. Here's my concern about that, and I've only seen this a few times, but I know it happens. I have seen council members get texts or emails during meetings from people in the audience during the council meeting, right? That's really bad form. It opens all sorts of doors. I think it's problematic, So I've always advised, and I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to tell you the truth. I've always advised all my councils to turn their phones off during the meeting. Turn them off, put them down. If you have the council pack it up on your device, and most of them do, their laptop, their Surface, whatever it is, keep that up. Close your email windows. Now, do I think there is one council member somewhere in this world who has observed that and done what I said? Maybe one. The rest of them have ignored me and always have their phones up, But the public can see what you're doing. We're all attuned enough now to what we do and the way we do it, that if you're glancing down at your phone during a council meeting, the public knows. They know what you're doing. When you drive past a car on the freeway and the guy's looking at his phone, you can tell, right? That's what he's doing. They know what you're doing in a public meeting when you're looking at your phone. And it's just a bad look, right? So
there and emailing or texting.
So the Zoom meeting thing's a good example, and something that I think we still need to think about, unfortunately, for the next little while. I don't know how long. But the question is, in Zoom, how does all this change? And the law hasn't changed. So text messages between council members during a Zoom meeting are still prohibited. If you're in different places, you still can't do it. Email is still prohibited between council members. You still can't do it. Let me say one other thing to you also. And this is hard during this weird time where we're still doing Zoom meetings. I'm the city attorney, and when I'm attending council meetings, I've sort of adopted the position that nobody cares to see me, and they only really on rare occasions want to hear me, right? So I'm there, I have my camera off, and I'm generally muted unless I'm spoken to. And I'm sorry to create the double standard, but I'm going to create it. For council members and mayors, you need to have your camera on, right? Your camera should be on, your mic should be open. The public should be able to know that you're there and you're engaged. That's an opinion. The law doesn't touch on that yet, but I really think that's the case. I think that's the better course for you. So, any other questions? Hopefully we don't have to deal with that for a whole lot longer.
I have a question. May I ask mine? So I understand the communication between city council members being prohibited, but why not between the public and a council member?
It's not prohibited. You can do it. I just think it's a really bad look during a council meeting. So you can do it. Yeah, it's not prohibited, but if your attention is there, where is it for the, it's just that kind of and you're getting a lot of my editorial and preference here. but
But it is prohibited between council members.
it is prohibited between council members. The thing that bothers me about that whole, sort of electronic communication between the public and somebody on the council during a meeting, the rest of the public who may not have access to you that way, there's a certain point in time where they can communicate with you. There's a certain way they communicate with you. It generally happens at the microphone during a public hearing, right? Or during a public comment period before a council meeting, or an email prior to a council meeting using, the email that the city has. If it's happening during a meeting, there may very well be a perception that somebody has access to you in a way that the general public doesn't, at a time that the general public doesn't. I just think it creates some difficulty and perception problems that I wouldn't want to deal with if there were an easy way to shut it off. And I kind of think there's a generally easy way to shut it off. So that's my thought on that.
Hi.
St. George.
St. George and then back to Orem, I think. So St. George, go.
My question is, when we're in the open meeting and we're replacing the council member because the mayor's become the mayor, does the vote have to, I read in the City Leaks and Towns and it said it recommends it to be open, that the actual vote itself. But my feeling is that it is actually an election, so it doesn't have to be open.
Cam, do you have the election code open or can you get it open? It's 20A1, like 501, maybe 510. We're looking at the code to make sure, but my memory is that the vote for that council member has to be open. There are certain things that the law allows us as count. Well, some of them say secret ballot, but I don't think this is one of them. Sean, where are you? I'm not sure he's there. We're looking for Sean Guzman because we know he just dealt with it.
It has to be on the record.
That's, yeah.
You can
So
take ballots, but you have to read those ballots out loud for the record.
Right. So because it's the body that is appointing the person to fill that unexpired term, to take that would otherwise be an elected office, the law treats it differently, and your vote has to be recorded. This whole process became so awkward and so difficult 5 or 6 years ago when they changed the law and made it so you can't do any part of this in a closed session anymore. It used to be that way back when councils would go into a closed session, they'd have really full, open, robust, very, very candid conversations about all the people applying to fill one of those positions. And then they'd come out, take their seats, council member would make a motion, somebody would make a second, they'd vote, and it was done. Comfortable, right? A little disconcerting maybe if you were somebody who was applying to fill that seat and didn't get it. You don't know why. I mean, I understand the policy of the law. I get that it feels like we're sort of, it feels maybe like an election. The law treats it differently and there's nothing we can do about it. That has to be open. So, okay, we'll get to you. And then it was back to Orem, right?
Yes, yes.
Orem, go.
Okay, back to the texting with the public and information like that. If that public is someone who is there, like a developer who is there presenting a development and they are directly contacting or texting anyone on the city council, is that an issue, or is that once again something that the law does not cover?
The law doesn't cover it. Yes, it's an issue. It's right. I mean, it's obviously an issue and it's uncomfortable and it shouldn't work that way. If I were on the council and I got one of those texts during a meeting and it was in some way substantive or helpful, I would note for the public that you just got a text from the developer. You usually wouldn't look at those in a meeting, but you got it, you see it, and there's some substantive information that ought to be presented on the application and it ought to be presented, right? Make it public, I think is the way you treat it. But those kind of private communications, there are times, and this is unavoidable. It happens everywhere. It's not just this state because, every town in Utah is a small town. Salt Lake's a small town, it's just the way it works. We all feel like we're in a small town, but At some point, somebody on the council is going to know somebody who's got an application before the council. And we can all foresee a situation where that person we know sends us a text during a meeting that says, what in the world is wrong with your fellow council member X? Why can't they see this? They're idiot. I mean, you can see that kind of communication coming. You can also see appropriate communication where they're saying, they don't understand this. That's not the way the drive approach works. This is what it's actually going to look like. That's substantive. That should get back in front of the council and you can disclose it. But if you don't have your phone where you're taking text messages from people, if it's turned upside down or whatever it is, and the developer has to, say to somebody on the staff, they're misapprehending, they don't understand the application. This is actually the way it works. I want to clear this up. That seems to me to be a more appropriate avenue to get the information in front of the council. So again, do I think many of my council members have observed my advice, close their phones? Probably not. They probably do it. But I just, I personally think it's such a dangerous thing, a bad look. And the perception that could be taken from that is wholly wrong, as opposed to being wholly right. So. Okay, let's go Salt Lake first.
My question goes back to electing or appointing a council member from a vacated seat. And is that done through an amendment or not an amendment? I cannot think of all the word all of a sudden. A ballot, or is it done through a ballot? Is it done through?
The question again is about the appointment of an interim officer, an interim elected official. And the question is, do we do that with a ballot or do we do it with a motion or an open vote? And different cities have created different processes for that. If you do it by ballot, though, Sean is correct. Sean, by the way, Sean Guzman is the former and I guess kind of current acting city attorney for the city of St. George. He's a major policy advisor for the league. He's been through the wars. He knows and understands all this so well. Sean just lived through it in St. George. It sounds to me like, and Sean, you can correct this, but it sounds to me like your process maybe was you at one point discussed using ballots, but you concluded that if you did that, you still had to disclose each council member's vote, even though it was done by a ballot. I would concur with that, and I think that's right. So to me, whether you're using a ballot or you're just making a motion, it all has to be public anyway.
You have to connect the council member to a particular ballot, not just read the ballots.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the question was, do you have to connect a council member to a particular ballot or vote? And my feeling under the statute currently is, yeah, you do. So then we're back to St. George again for one more, I think.
Yeah, so just clarifying on the mayor's role in that, does the mayor vote to break a tie in that appointment of an interim council member?
Yep. And that's dependent on the form of government, because if you're in one of those other forms where the mayor is a voting member of the governing body, they would vote anyway. If they're a non-voting mayor, they would break a tie.
It's a 6-member council.
With a non-voting mayor, the mayor would break a tie. Yes.
Different than what the book says. The book says.
I heard something, but I couldn't understand what was said. Say it again.
That is different than what the book says. The book says it will go to lots. You'll either draw straws, roll dice, flip a coin.
If the mayor's vote doesn't break a tie, right? Then if you can't do it, if they can't get a motion, if for some reason you don't have the mechanism, then it goes to lots or drawing straws. I've always viewed that going to lots or drawing straws as only applying when we can't get a motion and a second on the table. And then there has to be a vote with the two highest that do that drawing straws. I've actually never seen that happen. Sean, have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen it go to sort of drawing lots?
Yes, actually, it happens more often than you think. This is a poorly drafted statute. Let's just say that from the beginning. Dave Church and I have said for years we wanted to rewrite it. For example, it says your two highest vote getters go to the next round. It makes it sound like, okay, so you have to have two highest vote getters. Obviously, we say it doesn't matter if you've got a unanimous, you don't go to a second round. That's what I would think, not what the statute says, right? Then you've got the case of what happens in the next time if you have a tie again in the mayor's voting and there's a tie because there could be a vacancy on the council, what do you do then? You go to the lots, but who are the, it's not as clear as we would like it to be. And maybe that's something we ought to work on changing. But right now, yes, you'll go to lots. That could be a flipping of a coin. It could be, you know, a number between 1 and 10, which would be hard to do, obviously. But you can do all kinds of things, but doesn't, because it does not specify how you go about that part of it.
So games of chance in selecting appointed officials. It is, it is tough. The one thing I can tell you about it, though, it's got to be public now. So, all right, any others?
Question in Price.
One in Price, one in Ephraim, one St. George. So let's wrap it up.
Price first, go.
Okay, quick question. You made reference farther back in the discussion about signing an affidavit in a closed session.
Yes.
Elaborate.
In a closed session, you are required still to record the meeting unless the closed session is for the purpose of discussing the character, professional competence, or physical or mental health of an individual. In that case, you do not record the closed session. In lieu of the recording, the presiding officer in the closed section is required to sign an affidavit that says those were the things that were discussed and only those things were discussed. So that's the affidavit that comes out of that limited discussion in a closed session. You are, by the way, still required to have minutes of that closed session, but those minutes are a protected record. So then it was Ephraim.
Yeah, I'm wondering, during a meeting, you have somebody from the public that's very disruptive. At what point do you have the right to have that person removed from the meeting, and how do you go about that?
So the presiding officer of the meeting has the statutory duty to keep order in the meeting, and he has the, I guess, permissive authority to have someone removed if they are disorderly and disrupting the good order and conduct of the meeting. I have seen that done only one time. It is a heavy-handed tactic and it's really hard. It was accomplished by a sheriff in that case, and I would recommend that that be the way you do it. And so you know, in the case that I saw, the presiding officer indicated that because of the continued disruptions, he was going to call a recess in the meeting, and he was going to call the sheriff and have the person removed. And the person wouldn't leave. The sheriff arrived and helped them find their way out. And then the meeting resumed. And that left feelings in that community for 15 years. It's a really hard thing. Sometimes you have to do it. And it would be unfortunate, but my recommendation is that's the way you would do it. So. St. George, again. St. George is hot today. This is good.
No, we're good at St. George.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to meeting you at some point. Again, I'm not your attorney, but I'm an attorney. Feel free to call me if you need anything. I will, I'll do my very, very best to answer your question now. Your attorney might not think it's right, but it'll be an answer now. So thank you and good luck to all of you.